What's up, future Shredlords? Welcome back to the fingers. We're going old school and basically gorilla on this video. I figured it didn't actually need to be overly, special or effecty and whatnot, because we're talking about some pretty basic ideas. But believe you me, it's this stuff right here that take you from being like an amateur to being a pretty damn good musician. And it takes a long time to develop the skill set, if you will, and the mindset to be natural and fluid on the instrument, so it comes across as sounding cool and sort of, inspired, instead of, when you see somebody and they're really stiff and stuff. They get the job done for sure, but it's not the same. So that's all basically, those skills are acquired doing this kind of stuff. And in this case, we're going to be talking about connecting scales together. This is a huge one. So we're going to go through all the systems that I think are important. Of course, there are more. There are always more. And you can figure out your favorites too. But we're going to cover this idea again, looking for symmetry, looking for this symbiosis, if you will, between these two systems, and how we can start to take advantage of that in connecting them together so that we can take our chops to the next level. Right. Let's get into this. All right, I like to start off my practice sessions by defining the key. We're going to start in G, of course, 3rd fret, low E string. And then I start to flesh out the systems I want to use. I'm going to use the pentatonic system. All the way up and down the fretboard. Obviously, I'm going to use the classical system. And I'm going to use 3 notes per string. Okay, so right there, I'm basically starting to lay out some parameters that sort of constrain my playing, to make me think about what I'm doing rather than just going on rando mode, which is very important. Training your mind to control your hands, to recognize sounds and then react to them, is basically the secret sauce of the musician. Just like a great artist knows how to blend colors together to create a really realistic picture on like this massive canvas. We do the same thing with kind of sounds, but we're reacting to other sounds too. So it's a little bit more sort of group oriented rather than just the individual. But the same sort of creative process is true for both, right? So you have to start to see that it's the blending of these various sounds is like the ability to make it look like there's shadow, or the sculptures where they look like they have veils over top of them. It's just nuts. So think of in terms of that, where you're sort of like combining the systems. Right, whether they're adjacent like that, or then you can start to do what we call leaps or leapfrogging. Right, so go from like the major to the minor there, which is a really cool sound. And so, but still in the diatonic key. So when you're practicing and whatnot, when you're starting to connect scales together, think in terms of like just using a whole shape. And instead of moving to the next one where you'd still do the pentatonic shape, instead tack on like 3 notes per string, if you will, which would be Ionian. And then sort of calculate how to ascend. And you've got all the elements of a really great practice session there. You're like, take this original technique, 2 notes per string, 1 string, and then 3 notes per string. And you can use whatever technique you want. Essentially, I did economy picking. That's how I like to do it, but you do you. And then, of course, later on, you can start to then do the leaps, right? So you're like, okay, I'll start off with the major scale now. Be like, I want to jump up here. Into the Lydian position, I went from 1 to 3. right? So obviously 1 to 3 there is the major third. So if I take and I do it with a scale, it kind of has the same effect, but you get a slightly different vibe because obviously you're playing the notes one at a time. So, you know what I mean? You can get the same simulated type of effect using scales or chords. But in the case of scales, when you start to do those interval leaps, you know, you can start to tailor them, of course, to be even more specific, like with fourths or fifths or minor sixths and stuff, and then substitute other scales to actually get an even more killer effect. Okay, there it is. I'm going to stop it right there. So there it is, adjacent shapes and leapfrogging. Now, let's get into 3 octaves principle. All right, 3 octaves theory, here we go. Basically, you're starting on the G, jumping up here onto the D string, 5th fret, another G, 8th fret, B string, another G. So I can use that, obviously, with scales. You're like... Okay, that's kind of useful, right? Maybe do it with a scale. Right, maybe do it with 3 notes per string. Now, in that case, you're basically seeing a bit of a situation there where you have to start to think outside the box. You're like, doing it like that makes it sound really rudimentary. So you need to have an approach note come in from 7 here. Or essentially move it to the A string maybe. So this 3 octaves principle is very important, of course. You also can use it with arpeggios. Right, and of course you get into the level where you start to do these combinations. Not my best, but you get the idea. I tried to mix and match as many of those different ideas using the 3 octaves principle, and you can start to hear it has its own vibe when you do this classical stuff, right? And then you get into 3 notes per string. And then finally you move into like the 3 octave stuff. Almost got it, almost, but close enough, right? So that's why you got to start to be like, okay, start off with just combining some adjacent shapes. And then get into like the 3 notes per string. And then finally get into 3 octaves. And I think you'll find that moving around the fretboard gets a lot more interesting and a lot more useful too. And of course, you can then just substitute whether you want to do a scale or an arpeggio. Or both, right? So again, 3 octaves principle, very, very important. Let's look at scaling around next. All right, this last section here is on scaling around. Essentially, once you get good at connecting the scales together using the idea of using adjacent scales, right? That's very important, obviously, using the idea of moving on one string or a couple strings. That's using 3 notes per string in the major scale there, right, to do that little run. That's why that's important. Of course, then you can just be like... keep going with the 3 octaves principle, and of course you're starting to amalgamate all those together, but the big problem ends up is you get tunnel vision and you're doing it always like that sort of eighth or quarter note feel. And so what you have to do now is break it up in terms of using free play, which gives you the concept of scaling around, where it's like you're playing using scales, but you're trying to be musical instead of just going... which is fine, you know, obviously for certain instances you're sort of like... that's much better, obviously, and you're getting all of the essential elements in there. Notice the rakes and the slides and the vibrato, right? The bends. With that rake in there too. Classic Van Halen and millions of 80s guitar players, right? So that stuff takes a lifetime to master and inject into your playing, and that really is where the whole scaling around thing came from, is this idea that you have to be able to essentially insert that into the idea of playing scales, where it's not always just, you know, do this... it's a combination of all of them. It's the whole thing put together. Now, obviously, I'm starting to throw arpeggios in there. I shouldn't be doing that, but you get the idea. Is you have to have some sort of training platform to really unleash your full potential when it comes to using these scales. It's not enough just to know the positions. It's not enough to be able to combine them together. You have to combine them together in the different positions using the different systems and types, and then add musicality to it. Okay, so it doesn't actually have to get any more difficult or flashy than that. And honestly, you can start to see I'm really concentrating on get my hand up there on that big God slide and all the rest of that stuff. That's a big leap, right? So you start to see the connecting of the scales together. You're like, okay, I see the connection now. He's way down here doing a scale. He wants to get way up here, and it sounds cool. So that's the whole point. And that's where scaling around starts to come in. You want to set it up so that when you do that slide like that and you nail it, luckily this time I got close, it sounds great. And people are like, nice. Okay, so that's the idea of scaling around. A lot of times we get completely sort of in the zone with just doing the technical requirements and working with the metronome and being like playing fast and stuff. But I realized that that was a major level mistake. Instead, I should have been like, okay, I need to reevaluate what I'm doing, right? So in this case, you know, like... adding in that one note there from the harmonic minor. Notice how it just adds a whole new element to what I was just doing. Instead of just going... A little bit of a Scooby there, but it is what it is, right? So there it is, scaling around. It's up to you to sort of find your own voice and your own way of doing that. But that right there is an incredibly important skill, especially when you're talking about connecting scales together. And of course, you're just going to keep scaling that idea up, no pun intended, to include arpeggios and chords and even more complex techniques like triad pairs and ghost notes. There's a whole bunch of them in there that are just like mind-blowing. They can be used absolutely ridiculously to make your solo sound so good. Okay, so start working on the scaling around stuff and then start to factor in a few of these new scales. Once you get good at that and you start to work into the scaling around, start to factor in some of those notes from the other systems, you know, again. As long as I'm landing on this note here, okay, it's going to sound good. You see what I'm saying? And when you do this extra note there, it adds a whole new dimension. Plus, again, you're getting the perfect experience to be able to add that flavor to your improvisations in some sort of meaningful music context and do it in such a way that you're like, okay, I'm seeing these systems overlap so I can use them with respect to connecting scales together. And then, boom, you the master guitar player. Thanks for joining me. Appreciate every single one of you. We'll see you in the next one.